Hey, it's Chris, Legion Games, and I think the Game of Thrones ending was the best ending of a TV series ever. Nah, I'm just screwing with you. Come on, Martin, put out the fifth book. Hey, so today we're going to be talking top 10 retail games as of recently that have been disappointing or underwhelming for me personally. Again, as a full disclaimer, this is not that I'm saying that these games are bad. There are a lot of really, actually decently fun games that are good on this list, but they were personally disappointing for me. So this is purely subjective. I already did the Kickstarter one. I'll throw that in the link below in the comments if you haven't checked out that. But if you have, this is the follow-up version of the retail. Because as I said in that video, a lot of people associate big disappointments with Kickstarter because of the bucks that are shelled out or the amount of plastic that gets thrown on the table. But let's be clear, there are plenty of big retail disappointments out there. It's just what's a disappointment for you versus what's a disappointment for me. So I took 10 ones that stood out for me as I played this. I wanted to like it more, but there was something about it that just did not click, that I did not think it was as good as I had hoped for, and that just left me wanting for more. Let's take a look. Number 10 on that list. It's a little known game. It's gotten a little bit of 2019, 2020 walking in Burano. Now, this is a relatively simple card game in the sense that all you're doing is drafting cards and playing them in columns and sometimes a little bit of rows. And it's a nice game. It's nice. That's probably the best thing I can say about it, because you're sort of pattern matching, you're sort of trying to find selections on each tile that line up, because what you're doing is you're trying to line up the houses by color from bottom to top as you would normally build it. And you can scaffold, put in a placement card that sort of fills in the gap if you're missing one that you can replace later. And there's different tourists that can visit these houses. There's different residents that can be in these houses. And depending on what the cards are, you have different objectives, and the different tourists and citizens have different ways of giving bonus points. And so it's a sort of a set collection, bonus type end game, point salad, as much as I hate that term, ending where you're trying to end up with the best row of houses. Like I said before, it was nice. I didn't really just find myself enjoying it. My wife hated it, in fact. I was surprised, actually. I thought it was a little bit more calm. There's no take that. There's no I'm gonna attack your house versus you're gonna attack mine. It's just, you're building your nice neighborhood. I'm over here, you're over there, we're drafting. You're not even doing a lot of hate drafting because you're more concerned about what's going on in your buildings than you are with the other person's. And there's enough variability in the citizens and the tourists that it doesn't feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again. But it just left me wanting for more. It was a little bit too complex in terms of some of the matching to be super light and super fast to the table, but it wasn't heavy enough to make me feel like I was really truly getting a deep strategy in terms of my gameplay. And so it sort of fell in between the two categories of a little bit too heavy but a little bit too light at the same time. And so for that reason, I ended up trading it away. Now there's a sequel. I believe I haven't seen it, haven't heard it, but I'm a little bit risk averse now, so I probably won't be getting it unless someone ends up giving me a copy or something. So, but it did recently well enough to basically get a sequel, essentially. So it's not a bad game by any means, but it just did not click with us, especially my wife. Number 9. Now, this is Heroes of Terrinoth. Full disclaimer, I am not fully up with the Terrinoth lore and mythos and the world that goes along with that. I've never played the Terrinoth tabletop RPG. I never played the board game Legends of Dragonholt, Runebound, Rune Wars. I've never experienced any of those, so this particular IP did nothing for me to stand out to say, you know what, this is, based off of this, and wow, it really ties in really well. I didn't have any of that bias, for better or for worse, going in. It just felt very generic to me. As I said previously in one of my other videos talking about upcoming game trends that I'm concerned about, is the sameness between these games and how do you tell the difference between one and the other. And for me, you could have slapped any generic fantasy theme on this and it wouldn't have been terribly different. You got your four archetypes that are basically the same. You got a little bit of differentiation in terms of character customization. You've got your general enemies. You've got a little bit of your Lord of the Rings type LCG mesh where you've got quests, but also enemies engaging you. And it just didn't do anything to stand out. In fact, I think the other big disappointment with this is, especially fans of Terrinoth in general, is the fact that they thought Fantasy Flight Games was going to really bolster this. And I don't know what happened on the backside of it, but this was a game that came out in 2018, and there was an expectation of Fantasy Flight Games, as with a lot of their IPs and even other IPs within the Terrinoth world, that they have gotten iterations, expansions, layer upon layer, and nothing has ever come of this. And I think a lot of people were disappointed because if you were given the chance to get a couple expansions, maybe it could have had that differentiation that has sort of separated it from some of its predecessors or its kin within this same type of genre. And it just never got it, and it sort of just disappointed me, and I ended up trading it away. The potential was there, and I don't think it's a bad game. It's just, how do I compare it to anything else when it feels just so alike everything else? So that is number 9, Heroes of Terrinoth. Now, number 8, this one is Victorian Masterminds. It sort of captured our imagination when it was first announced. This was an Eric Lang game, sort of outside of the Kickstarter CMON bubble. Like Awaken Realms, CMON has their sort of retail branch, the CMON Limited, just like Awaken Realms Lite. Things that are not needing crowdfunding, that they do not use that method to support games like this. And for the longest time prior to this release in 2019, there really wasn't a whole lot of information except for what was known about the theme. What was known was that this was Sherlock Holmes is dead. You're in Victorian England. The bad guys from Sherlock Holmes, like Moriarty, are running amok trying to conquer the city. And it had this steampunk type vibe until it really almost immediately when it came out, what the mechanisms were going to be, how things interacted, how it played, any of that sort of stuff. So when it actually hit retail, I think people were a little surprised, I being one of those people who ended up with a copy. It became more worker placement with a little bit of area control rather than the Amerithrash game that I think at least people like myself were hoping for. And so for that reason, it was a disappointment. Because I love the steampunk type theme. Rise of Moloch from CMON Games, The World of Smog, is one of my favorite games. And I was hoping that this could play a riff off of that. Clearly, I was wrong. What you're essentially doing is trying to go to various areas or cities and build via the resources that are there that you can acquire your secret contraption. And it sort of reminds me of Steampunk Rally in the sense that you're sort of building this contraption that has different parts and different functions, and you get different bonuses based on which parts are complete and which aren't. And there's a layering mechanism in terms of when you're placing your workers in certain areas and how that affects what you get and when you get it. And so there's some unique elements compared to other worker placements, but I'm not a worker placement guy. So in the end, again, like the other 2 games I've already mentioned, I ended up trading it away to someone else who had much more interest and hopefully enjoyed it much more than I did. Number 7. You're not going to see many of this type of game on my disappointment list. This is an abstract game. This one is Shobu. I really like abstracts. My wife, despite her doth protest too much, likes abstracts too. They're quick, they're really easy to get to the table, the overhead rules are relatively low, and the replayability is almost infinite. And for those out there, there is a lot of perfect information elements. And that's not always perfect information, but there's a large portion of that, at least in the majority of these. Shobu is one of those where it is absolutely perfect information. And what Shobu is, as you can see on the picture here, it's 4 separate boards, and you are either the white stones or the black stones. And you have 2 separate boards. On one board, you move one of your pieces. And on the other board, you have to mimic the exact same move. And the objective is to knock the other person's stones off of the board. For one, the price point is way too high. The stones are completely like they got them off of the side of the road in terms of different shapes and sizes. And some are going to say that that plays to the aesthetic. I think that takes away from it. The components are detriment in this game. That being said, I don't care about components most of the time. Most of the time. And to be transparent here, I'm not sure I can exactly eloquently put why my wife and I, neither of us, really enjoyed this game. Because the ratings are relatively high. It's the 24th ranked abstract on Board Game Geek right now. So again, this is not a bad game. This is a very elegant game. This is a very thinky game. And maybe that's part of it, is it's a little bit too thinky, and it causes a little bit too much analysis paralysis. But it just did not click in the way a lot of the other abstracts have for me. Like Tak, like Yinch, like Zertz, Soloween. All of those games are just more intuitive in with the way my mind works. And for some reason, Shobu, with the directionality as well as the multi-board factor, I can see how it is highly rated and highly thought of, in akin to a combination of like chess and Go, as a very poor man's analogy right there, in terms of moving and capturing and sliding and knocking pieces. But it just did not click with us. And I really had high hopes for this when the reviews initially were quite good, because I'm always on the market for another good abstract. As I mentioned, we really enjoy abstracts, and so I am really, really, really interested because of all of the things I mentioned already, but we could just not get into it. So I ended up, I think I ended up selling it actually, locally, I believe. But for me, it was a disappointment in a sad way. Like, I really wanted to like this one. C'est la vie. Sometimes that's just the way it is, though. We all know that. We've all had games like that. Number 6. I traded for this one too. This is a little different one. This is going to be a little side tangent. I have a couple kids. Couple kids, like it's an unknown number. I have 3 kids. Almost 7, 5, and a newborn. And the older 2 now, they play a lot of games with me. And we're starting to get a little bit more advanced, but not totally. And so I thought, in the genius dad moment that I had, Monopoly Gamer would be a sort of nice bridge between kids games and a little bit more adult games. And contrary to what the name actually is, it's not really much like Monopoly, except for the fact that you're going around the same style of board and you're buying properties. The rest of it is relatively dissimilar. I mean, you're rolling dice, and one die is the power you get on that turn. The other die is, I think, how far you're moving. The big difference is, as you go around, I mean, you can hit people on the board, they drop coins, you pass where the coins are, you pick them up, you're buying properties. When for anyone gets around the go, you fight a boss, and if that person can't beat the boss, which is a random die roll, then everybody else gets a chance, but it costs money to fight the boss in the first place. And each of the characters has a different power. I mean, if you get all of the separate little single expansions, there's something like 13 different Mario characters, and they've all just got different variations of powers, and it's fun. It's fun. It really is fun. We had a fun time with it. But especially with 2 people, and even 3, it just seemed to outstay its welcome. It just seemed to be a little bit too long for what it was, especially with the kids, because you have to go around enough times to get through the whole boss deck. And there are powers and there are things in the game that will set you back and not allow you to pass go that round. And so then that makes the game that much longer. And with kids my age that I have, they have a very limited attention span for things like this. And so it has to be continually engaging. And I mean, the setup wasn't terrible. It wasn't great. But that was another thing, you know, the coins, all of the cards, sorting the bosses depending on how many players you're playing with. So just little things like that. It became more tedious. And I did not relish the thought of getting it out at that point because of those things. And my kids just sort of became lukewarm on it, to be very frank. And so for those reasons, I ended up selling it. I was a little disappointed because I thought it would have been a nice game, and it was for a very brief time. But I'm also glad I sold it. I don't have any seller's regret because it clearly did not click fully with me. And as much as I wanted it to click even more with them, because if it clicks with them, I can get through my own prejudice and my own, you know, distaste for any game at this point, if it's for them. Just because I love nurturing them and just being with them and being able to do anything with them. But they didn't get that from it either. So it had to go. Number 5. Another one I ended up getting, as I think I got this as a pay it forward. Ticket to Ride Nordic. I've had Ticket to Ride Europe for a long time. It's enjoyable. You know what it is. It's straightforward. It's Europe, so I think it's the better one. If you're going to get just one as a starter, I think Europe is the way to go. It's not very cutthroat. It's as cutthroat as you make it. It's also not very tight, so there's a lot of open space, so you can all kind of do your own thing without even having to sort of overlap too much. Nordic is sort of the opposite. Nordic is the 2 to 3 player one, where it is extremely tight, extremely cutthroat. And again, the first 2 playthroughs were very enjoyable. But I read this comment online, and for better or for worse, it soured me on Nordic, because I realized it after looking back on our playthroughs, my wife and I, because this is a great game for my wife and I, because it's fast. I mean, Ticket to Ride is Ticket to Ride. You just, whatever spice or variation that is in that game, you can throw it in. And what the comment was that there is this center track in the lower part of the map. And as long as you're on that, almost anything is going to go off of that north or south, except for like the very northern ones, which they basically said to avoid. And you'll have a straightforward path to victory. And there's enough room for 2 people to essentially do that. And that's exactly what happened in our games, is that we were both along that mainline track, and we would literally get, you know, objectives and routes that were almost close to being done, because that is so central, and there are so many just slight variants just a little bit off of that. And I looked at it then from the side of how different is this going to be in the future? And if I play this with someone who hasn't played it before, it's going to give me an unfair knowledge advantage discrepancy that would make it partially unfun for me because I knew I would have that advantage, and then unfun for them because I would probably stomp them. So I ended up trading it away again. It just, you know, for better or for worse, because I think I probably would have gotten to that thought eventually, but it sort of sped up the process. So it was sort of a blessing and a curse sometimes. I don't know if you're like me, but I like actually using the negative comments on Board Game Geek and other sites and other reviews to see whether or not that is an acceptable criticism that I can deal with or not. And in this case, it was one of those that just sort of burrowed its way into my brain, and I couldn't get it out of my head. So on the chopping block it went. Ticket to Ride, Nordic countries. Number 4. Number 4 is Castles of the Mad King Ludwig. Castles of the Mad King Ludwig reminds me of what I hoped for when I first started playing games in this hobby. the ability to sort of build your own mishmash game pieces together so you can build the better puzzle than someone else. There are a lot of pieces in Castles of the Mad King Ludwig. The setup is relatively burdensome in terms of separating those out in the piles, especially in the player counts. There are also a lot of small rules about rooms next to other rooms in terms of bonuses, in terms of detriments, in terms of just things to remember. So much so that I didn't enjoy teaching it to other people when we had it. I kind of enjoyed playing it because we didn't have all of the, the variability there the first time I played it. But when I had it on my own and was trying to teach it to others, there was a lot more there than it first meets the eye. And and I'm not against there being a lot more there than first meets the eye, but a lot of it didn't seem like it was necessarily adding to the fun. It felt more like bookkeeping to me. And I have games that do bookkeeping, but this was not one that I enjoyed doing the bookkeeping with. I enjoy doing the bookkeeping on Quacks. I enjoy doing the bookkeeping on Isle of Skye or things like that. This just did not click with me the way those other two games did in that sense. Again, this is a good game. But for me, it just did not work well. And it didn't really work well in terms of the people that I game with. And I think that's just as important. It was just too much overhead for too little payoff. So as much as the expectation was there, it just failed to be able to meet it in our eyes. So number 3, and this is totally not because on a top 10 list, who would ever skip over a number and have to retape it at a later date with a different shirt and a different background and different setup. No one I know. Number 3 is Carnival of Monsters by Richard Garfield. Yes, that Richard Garfield, the one who made your favorite game, King of Tokyo. No, I'm just screwing with you. Android, Netrunner, Magic the Gathering. He is across the board known for things. Although I didn't actually know he was King of Tokyo, which actually is one of my higher favorite games. Anyway, so Carnival of Monsters, and this was sort of his foray into the more recent realm of the actual tabletop as opposed to just the card games. And the pedigree is there, but the gameplay just really isn't. It just doesn't stack up with similar games that are out there. And basically, it's a card drafting game. You're taking cards that are monster cards, or basically the equivalent of mana cards, that are going to allow you to pay for the monster cards that you're going. The drafting, you don't see a lot of good drafting games out there, especially at higher counts. The level of confrontation is low, as with a lot of drafting games. But the contrast is that the decision making is relatively minimal. It's straightforward. It's relatively simplistic. It's just a matter of what you get. There is a lot of luck in this game that you just absolutely can't mitigate. As a card game where I'm drafting, not being able to mitigate, not being able to change on the fly, and having it be super obvious, it just sort of sucked the fun out of the game. And this was when I was playing with my 6-year-old. There is no sense of urgency. There is no sense of tense tactical maneuvering in terms of what card you're going to get versus what card are you going to pass on. You can't pass on a card and just get currency. So you're either going to get it and be able to buy it, or get it and lose points. I guess I am just not as big a fan of drafting in general as I thought. I've heard this game being compared to sort of Magic the Gathering combined with Seven Wonders, which is a very apt description. At the same time, if you want to play Magic the Gathering, go play Magic the Gathering. If you want to play Seven Wonders, I'd say play that instead. The fact that this sort of straddles the fence between the two might appeal to some, especially in a lower player count when Seven Wonders doesn't really shine. But overall, the gameplay was just too linear, too narrow, and I didn't think there was enough way to mitigate the drafting strategy. One of the biggest criticisms I guess I would level at this game is the fact that when you're drafting, it is completely arbitrary. It's sort of like you know when you do Marvel Legendary and you have the hero deck and you get all 5 heroes and you make this huge stack of hero cards, and if you just randomly shuffle wrong, all of the super powerful high cost hero cards are going to be at the bottom of the deck. And that's what can happen in this game, is that just by the sheer size of the monster deck that you do each time, you may get things that are completely against what you're going for, or things that are never going to line up with your strategy or the mana cards that are pulled at the same time. So there may be absolutely no way to mitigate that because it is such a big deck. And it's not like you divide the deck into rounds. So round one, you pull from, a quarter of this first quarter of the deck, and round two you pull from the second quarter. So at least then you could mitigate it a little bit and know that you're going to get a little bit more variation, and you're not just stuck pulling from the top every single time without any way to change that up. The art is absolutely fantastic, as is expected, and that is one of the main compliments that this game has gotten. At the same time, art does not carry a game solely, and this game just felt too mechanical in nature. Like I was going through the motions rather than making a serious hardline decision each time I had the cards passed to me, or what I was thinking about hate drafting so that the next person couldn't get it. I am usually a fan of games that do not require a lot of skill. But this one, it doesn't seem like there is much skill element to it. And in combination with the drafting, it just sort of feels like you're just kind of floating out there at the whim of whatever comes your way. So all in all, I sold it after I got it. At least what I'll say, and one reason this ranks higher than a lot of other games on the list, is that unlike a lot of the other games on this list, I would at least be willing to play them. I at least, had a decent amount of enjoyment or fun with them, even though I probably wouldn't choose them myself to play again. If someone pulled this out, I think I would be more like, no thanks, I think I'll pass. Which I don't do that often. And so it just sort of left that bad taste in my mouth. So that's why Carnival of Monsters is number 3. Number 2, Blitzkrieg, with the Nippon expansion. I bought this on the Board Game Geek website under an auction. Got a great deal on it when it was out of print. I probably paid half of what it was going for at the time. I was happy with that. We played it a few times, my wife and I. I beat her a few times. And it was another game where, even after reading reviews and watching a few other reviews like Tom Vassel's, knowing the replayability there, it left me wanting at the end for more. I understand, you can play it in 20 minutes. I understand the likability. It is a very light wargamers game. It is a bag builder-esque, which I really enjoy. And it is very quick to get to the table, quick overhead, quick explanation, relatively intuitive. But for some reason, and again, I think part of it was because my wife just didn't enjoy herself. She did not enjoy this type of game. Who you game with and what they enjoy has a big influence on what you then thus enjoy. And I'm not just saying that because of the quote, happy wife, happy life. There are plenty of games that I'm going to keep despite her hating them. I'm looking at you, Tak, and Yinch. But this was one that I really wanted to like more. And I forced myself to play it a few more times because I was hoping to capture that magic the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth time I played it. And every time, it just felt like it was missing something. The different abilities are nice. The mechanisms of placing the guys on the board and thus getting the powers that are labeled on the board and having to balance, do I want to place this now and then give my opponent the next one, or my opponent the area if I put it too early, is a great dynamic. And I would love to see that used elsewhere. I think that is highly underused. At the same time, it just felt like there was an element that needed to be a little bit more complicated. And I don't usually say that about games, that I want them a little bit more complicated, as opposed to most of these on the list that I've said, okay, I need a little bit less. I just wanted something else in there. Something else was missing. The best thing I can compare it to is Quacks of Quedlinburg. The fun, gotcha, oh my gosh element of Quacks, if you've played Quacks as a bag building, drawing out of the bag randomly, it just wasn't there for me in Blitzkrieg. That's probably as close to being able to explain my feelings on it in an analogy as I can. So, what's number one? Number one. Number one was one that came with a fair amount of hype. I know a lot of people still like it. It's gotten really, relatively very good reviews. And it's Era, Medieval Age. This is sort of a twist on the roll and write. This is a roll and build. Sort of like if you took the roll and write genre and combined it with the game Battleship, where you're putting your little ships with pegs down and you're lining them up. Well, imagine you're trying to build a town instead of hiding your battleships. And the resources you get are based on how you roll. And you're getting resources and you're passing dice around and you're taking your turns. The positives is that the table presence, as many people have said, is really good. I mean, it's 3D roll and write, essentially. The pieces are nice. The player boards are ugly. You've heard that all before if you've talked about or read anything about this game. I know the depth and strategy is there, but for us, it seemed very dry. It seemed very mechanical in our terms. We didn't have a whole lot of variation. The Take That is very different. I am one of the last people that is going to criticize a game that does Take That. I love Take That normally. But the Yahtzee style dice rolling for the skulls to get the Take That mechanism in the game was completely arbitrary. And with the more people you played with, the more you could be affected or ganged up on in that sense, and not being able to mitigate that at all. Otherwise, it's a really good 3D spatial puzzle resource management type game. But for us, 3D spatial is apparently not my forte. And the dice rolling, as much as I love dice rolling, sort of left me very dry feeling, as I said earlier. The other factor that goes into this is the price point. The 3D spatial element is going to cost you an arm and a leg compared to the other roll and writes out there. Most other roll and writes are averaging between $18 and $25. This is going right now for $49.99 on Miniature Market. This is going for $52.99 on Amazon. And I don't think the gameplay itself is anything standout-ish compared to several other similar games out there in the same genre. I would much prefer to play something like Cartographers for $18 than this for nearly triple that price. The 3D spatial element does not add that much, and for me it's a detriment because of how I process, because that sort of negatively affects my ability to handle that. And that's on me. And that was a disappointment for me personally, because I really wanted to like this, because I don't have many in that genre at all. At the same time, I couldn't justify it because I just didn't like it. I'm not going to keep a game I like just because the reviews are positive elsewhere. That is a FOMO of a different type. And I'm not going to be held captive by other people's expectations or assertions on a game. We all like different things. And it's okay that we like different things. We have to remember that and tell ourselves that, instead of constantly second guessing sometimes, why don't I like this game? What am I missing about this game? There are just games that don't click with you. And this was one of them for me. But now I know. And I'm better off for it. Again, further giving myself the ability to know what I don't like and what I like so that I can make wiser decisions and choices about my buying practices and purchases in the future. There we go. So, those were 10 games at the retail level that were underwhelming or disappointing for me. What's one or two games or something that you were surprised by that was disappointing? No copping out, no going with easy ones. No Scythe, no Wingspan, none of those. Something that you were really gung ho about that you didn't, just fell flat for you. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. As for upcoming videos, another board game news video, another board game power ranking video, and then just whatever strikes my fancy. Hopefully, I'll maybe have another couple short reviews coming up of games that I think are great. And then I'm going to be looking at games that are big coming up in 2021, Kickstarters, crowdfunders that should be on your radar, probably my top 10, and then just a smattering overview. So I'll probably try and have those out before the end of December so that you can start planning your wallet post-holidays. And then at some point, I will hopefully have a list going back further about Kickstarters that have been delivered, my top of 2020, my top of 2020 yet to be delivered, and then some review of Kickstarter in years past as well. So a little bit of everything. And maybe I'll even throw in a best of 2020 in general. Best games I've played, best games of 2020, period. I've never done a top whatever list of my favorite games. So now that I have a game channel, might as well, right? Hey, throw me a sub. The goal, as always, is 1,000 subs in 2021. Can we do it? I'd like to believe I can. So let me know what you think. I have a Patreon. It's down below, whatever. Thanks for watching, if you made it this far. Throw me a shout out. Stay classy.